All right, so thank you for joining us for another Tiring House industry interview. This week we have the fabulous Florence Meredith. She is working at Trinity Laban and has been designing for dance for years and years. And she and I actually went to university together to study costume. So, welcome, Florence.
Thank you for having me. It's a
Oh,
pleasure.
it's so exciting to finally talk to you officially. So, I guess the first question is really, you work mostly in dance at the moment. Is that something that you've like consciously done, or is it just how your career's evolved accidentally, really?
To be honest, it's just how it's sort of naturally evolved. Yeah, I suppose, though I have always been interested in dance as a type of performance, I left university and started an internship at Laban, which is where I now work permanently currently. Yeah, and I just sort of fell in love with it really, and haven't stopped working with dance since. So yeah,
Yeah.
um, yeah.
Is it something that do you feel like that kind of because I could see how it would either be limiting as far as people need to do X, Y, and Z in these, so I really have to be careful, or do you feel like it's a freedom because a lot of times they're not very literal? So I know a lot of dances you don't have to worry about. This is 1987 in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and you have that freedom.
Yeah, it's kind of both, to be honest. And I think that's why I love it so much. So there's a lot of freedom in terms of where you go with design. And also because it's so collaborative, the whole process for that reason. You can kind of completely flip a piece of design on its head, should that work for you and the choreographer, which is quite exciting. Because yeah, like you say, you're not tied to a particular context necessarily. I mean, sometimes that happens, but often it's not anything to do with narrative, which is really freeing. But then simultaneously, I also work a lot as a maker, and the challenges of making for dance are extensive, but also really fascinating. So one of my favourite parts about working with dance is the fitting process, because when you're in a fitting, you have to essentially work out if it's going to work with all of the possible movement that their body might do, which could be quite extreme. And you've got to make sure that it's behaving how you want it to behave for your design to be effective, which can be really challenging, but it's really, that problem solving is why I love it so much, I think.
Yeah, it makes sense. It's like a puzzle basically every time.
Exactly, yeah, constantly solving the puzzle, whether that's what on earth this design concept is going to be and how it's going to affect the work, or how on earth am I going to make these really exciting trousers work with that specific bit of contact choreography. It's really exciting, and every project you learn something new. Yeah.
Do you feel like it helps then that you do both as well? Because I would imagine when that interpretation between designer and maker might be a tricky thing in dance if you don't at least have the skills and the knowledge of a maker.
It's quite interesting because I suppose I've worked both as designer maker, as a maker for a designer, as a designer for a maker, if that makes sense. So angles, but it is quite interesting because if you're doing both, they definitely feed into each other, which I'm sure is true for a lot of designers that work with narrative types of work in theatre. But it's they definitely feed into each other, and I think as a designer I'm quite tactile, and I like to try things out and try things on and try things on a dancer and then make decisions that way, which I think is probably partly because I've done so much making that the 3D, sometimes it goes 3D to 2D back to 3D rather than 2D to 3D, which with dance can also be really important. So sort of that like devising costume at the same time as the work is being devised is quite useful, particularly if the choreographers like to work with materials, and if they're inspired by that as well, that's really exciting. It just all depends on the project, I suppose, but it's also really inspiring when you're a designer and you hand something over to a maker and you have to explain what you want it to do in movement, and then you see how they solve that, and sometimes that's really exciting because they bring something else that you you would have never solved it that way.
Right.
And there's 1,000 different ways to achieve that effect, but they've picked that one for those reasons. And yeah, that's also great. So yeah.
Wow. So it sounds like there's a lot of more flexibility than if you're designing for like a play or an opera, where it's very much here's the design and go make this happen exactly. It sounds like there's a bit more give and take then.
Yeah, and it kind of depends on the choreographer and how they work. So sometimes I've worked with choreographers who have a really strong like visual at the start of a project, and then they build everything into that, and you're kind of interpreting, the costumes and, getting into the nitty gritty of the design. And there's other times where, you're really involved in how the work develops, and you really collaborate closely. And both are really exciting. So
I know most of us have been like totally out of work for the last year and a half. What have you been doing over the course of the pandemic to kind of keep yourself busy or in that world, at least even if you're not working all the time?
Well, so I have actually been working full-time pretty much the whole time. I've been really lucky. So there were a few months where I was on furlough. I, like many people, kept myself busy making masks for everyone I knew, and some charities and things, and scrubs as well. I don't know if you were part of that as well, Charles. I know you
know about the scrubs. That's amazing.
But yeah, and then so actual work-wise, I've been working with the MA course at Laban. So they have a course which is an MA contemporary dance, but they kind of, the year is sort of like a company. They operate as a company would operate. So they have 3 choreographic processes, and each, there'll be 3 staff members that work with each choreographer. This year I was working with Rahel von Moos, who's a choreographer who I've known for a really long time but never had the chance to work with until now. So that was very enjoyable, but it was quite strange in that usually we would work over like a sort of 5-week rehearsal period, and then by the end of that 5 weeks I would have completed my design, and then there would be another month where I would realise the designs with my colleagues, and then later down the line they go on tour, and it's very exciting in real places with real humans. Really different. Yeah, so they're about to go on tour. I'm actually in a tech tomorrow for this piece, but it's been strung out, this process of designing and developing these 3 pieces of work and the costumes. So for me and Rahel, the process started last year, the end of last year, for 2.5 weeks, and then there was a massive gap, and then and I designed and made the costumes for the unfinished piece, and then now the piece has been finished, so it's going to be really interesting tying it all up together in the lighting. But I think it's going to work. Yeah, I'm pretty convinced.
I mean, if you're convinced, the audience will be. I feel like it's
will be. Yeah, it's I think it'll be an exciting one. I can't wait to be in a tech again, to be honest. So
I miss tech more than I ever thought I would, which is something you don't think you'll say a lot when you're like 18 hours a day for 2 weeks. You're like, I think I'm going insane, but you really miss it.
Isn't it so much, so full of anxiety, but now it's just, I'm just so excited. I want to see some lights on those costumes.
Are they performing in front of a live audience, or is it being recorded?
No, so it'll be live streamed as far as I'm aware. But obviously, I think there's a limited capacity for audience. Okay. So we're very lucky at Laban that we have a gorgeous theatre, but it's relatively small. So usually I think it can seat about 300, but obviously that's completely reduced at the moment. And so not yet open to the public. Right. So as far as I'm aware, there'll be a few staff members. So there'll be some people, and then when they eventually go on tour, throughout the summer, they'll get some real audiences. So that'll be exciting. And then they'll come back to Laban and perform again, which is always lovely to see, because, your costumes go off on tour and then they come back and the dancers have, really developed, and the piece has got something new added to it from their experience. And that's always really joyful. So I can't wait for that.
It must be exciting to know. in our business, there's so much freelance that happens and so much, I don't know what's coming next and I don't know what I'm working on next. And you seem to have a fairly consistent, relatively consistent schedule since you work for a school. Yeah, so that must be, I mean, how far in advance do you get to start working on these things? Is it like, well, I knew about this 3 years ago, or is it still pretty fresh?
It's not quite that radical. And obviously this last year and going forwards, things have, been confirmed much closer to the date. Is it going to be online? Are going to be any live performance at all? Like, is it going to be some kind of combination of the two? And so obviously, everyone's got to stay safe and wait until we definitely know what we're doing before we commit to it. But usually working in higher education means that in September, what you're going to be doing next June. You might not know who you're going to work with, but you'll know what the project will be, and roughly how long it's you're going to be able to work on that project, and when you might be able to start thinking about it, which is really enjoyable. It's quite an unusual position to be in this industry. You have no clue what you're doing next month, let alone half a year in advance.
Yeah.
So I feel very lucky to have that sort of reassurance currently. And it's been really interesting for me because I freelanced for years before taking this position, almost 2 years ago now, and it's given me a bit of a chance to sort of step back and just really focus on my practice and the educational element of what I'm doing, working with students and thinking about their learning, which is what it's all about for us. Has really made me sort of become a bit more analytical about what I'm doing and why I'm doing it, and the choices I'm making, because you're sort of needing to explain that quite often, or working directly with a student choreographer and guiding them through working with a designer, which has been really interesting. So hopefully when I eventually freelance again, I'll have a slightly different perspective than that I had when I was a fresh graduate with yourself. Way back when. Some time ago now.
We're going to pretend that it was just last year, and it was definitely not eons.
It's been a
yeah. But so I know Laban they mostly teach dance and choreography and that sort of thing. So the makers that you work with, are they learning as well, or are they all professionals?
So in terms of permanent staff, myself and the costume supervisor work together to sort of oversee a lot of the projects, and we also work with a graduate intern, and that we hire a new graduate intern every year for one full academic year, and they're usually a fresh graduate from some kind of relevant course, but it's and we sort of spend a few months teaching them and letting them shadow projects, and then eventually by the end of the academic year they get to do their own designing and making, which is really lovely. I really enjoy working with teaching, I suppose. Just helping someone develop those skills is quite exciting, and seeing what kind of designer they become by the end of it. And then in terms of freelancers, so we have a few projects per year where we need lots of people in the room to get through all of the different designs and makes that need to happen simultaneously, which is always great fun. We tend to hire people who design and make, so they can come in and do a whole project sort of independently, and sometimes that, depending on the project, it might not quite work out that way, and they might just come in to help us power through some alterations for 2 weeks. Lovely. But all of them will be freelance costume makers, designers, who have all these exciting skills that they come in and they tell us about their interesting work they've been doing, and it's brilliant to have them in the room, because I think it's helpful to constantly be aware of like what everyone else is doing, and like sharing just thoughts and ideas and ways of making things, yeah, as I said before, there's no one way of doing things, and there's no sort of perfect this is how things should be done in costume.
Right.
There's a million ways to do it, everything. So it's always lovely, yeah, just seeing how other people go about making exciting costume.
Yeah, I would imagine you learn quite a lot, even though even in school you were painfully skilled, like obnoxiously good at what you do. But I would imagine this kind of sharpens it, because you not only are you explaining to someone who's learning, but you also get to learn from all the other people that you bring in.
Yeah, I think that's really important. You know, throughout your career, is that you don't know it all, and you're never going to know it all, and that's, you always have to be open to, yeah, listen to other people and learn from them. And yeah, it's a really lovely way to work, I think.
Do you see, like, going forward, do you see dance being your main concentration for your entire career, or are you looking to, move around and try new things?
I think I probably will always want to work with dance if I can. Obviously, as I'm sure you have experienced, you can't always direct your work exactly to the things you want to. But as far as possible, I think so. Because it's just the thing that I enjoy working with the most. And I think, though I can imagine myself working with perhaps like physical theatre or other types of, very sort of like movement focused theatre, I think dance, probably sums it up quite well. But yeah, who knows? You sort of never know, do you?
True.
Where you will be taken by an interesting person or an interesting project. Yeah.
You seem to be very tactile, and I don't know, it sounds like your design process is very much based on that movement and seeing how the fabric works, and that, rather than necessarily like character based or story based. I mean, unless, correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems.
No, yeah, totally. Because, so I work with contemporary dance a lot, and that's, all sort of concept based. So you're thinking more about the mood and the concept as a whole, rather than individual dancers necessarily.
Right.
And yet, obviously, sometimes the contrary is true. But yeah, I would say that with dance, you really have to think about things in a completely 3D moving way, where, right from the off. And sometimes that's really unpredictable. So it's exciting and also very practical to do things in 3D. And like I was saying, normally, obviously, this last year I've really had to hold myself back from just putting costumes on myself, because I love to test if something works. There's not a dancer there, I'll just put it on and move around a bit and see what happens. But yeah, I think tactility and the actual 3D things are really important to how I solve design problems. Yeah.
Very practical, and yeah, that's amazing. Do you, I don't know, so making and getting your hands on things, is that something you also just want to keep? It sounds really important to you, even if you do, as your career progresses, usually you tend to move away from that, but is that something you're keen to?
Yeah, I think I can see myself naturally moving slightly further away from, the ins and outs of the how am I going to put the zip in, or what fastening we're going to use. I think I always want to be involved in, a little bit in toiling and trying things out in the studio physically. But yeah, I think I can see myself always needing to touch things, but that doesn't necessarily mean that I'm going to have to do all of the jobs all of the time.
In there with a needle and thread, putting buttons back on is maybe not the goal.
Maybe that's all right. Maybe putting some nice buttons on, if that's my contribution to the making. But yeah, I think, like I was saying earlier, I think it's just that, you know, some designers don't work like that, but and that's, you know, valid, and they make, you know, work that's interesting in a different way. But yeah, I think for me, I'll probably always want to feel sort of a bit more physically attached to the costumes. Yeah, and interesting things come out of it, I think, as well, when you're involved in the making process, and, you know, the problem solving of it sometimes results in a more interesting design. You know, you need to change something because it's not quite working, but, you know, you remember a bit of other fabric that you were using to make another part of a costume, and, you know, you realize that would work really perfectly in some other interesting way with that particular movement. Yeah.
Oh, that makes sense. That's really, it's like there's 1,000 ways to make something. It sounds like there's 1,000 ways to design something as well. Yeah.
Yeah, that's what's exciting about design for performance, I guess.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it can be anything.
Yeah, it sounds like you have fun with your design and you play with it. Well, if you're putting it on your body, I would imagine that means you're having some fun.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, you have to have fun with it, don't you? Otherwise, what are we doing? You can't take yourself seriously, I think. Yeah, in life, but also, yeah, with costume design, you have to be a bit playful, I think, and enjoy it. And yeah, and then the problem solving isn't quite so tiring, I suppose. It's more inspiring and enjoyable. Yeah.
Yeah, I feel like playful people always come up with the best ideas as well, because you aren't as limited. If you're in there just messing about, something magical can happen. So.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's always, you know, I'm sure you've experienced that with, you know, you're agonizing over a design and you're looking at loads of images and you're really concentrating, and then you go off and hang out with your friends at a museum, you know, and go to an exciting exhibition or something and completely switch off, and then suddenly you return to your work and you can just immediately resolve all of the things that you're worrying about a few days before.
Absolutely.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah.
Nice. Well, I won't keep you any longer, but thank you so much for chatting with us. It was, well, it's always delightful to see you. But
It's delightful to meet you.
but thank you so much.